But we can talk afterwards. Was there another question over here? One more.
Oh, well, just judging from what's on television, there's so much advertising for new treatments. Is there so many new things that are coming out for people? Because PrEP was the last thing I heard about.
Right.
Is there a number of new treatments that are coming out generally for HIV instead of a specific
Yeah. I'm going to stick a pin in that, and we're going to answer that one later, okay? Because I want to get to the HIV aging things that we have on our agenda. Actually, there are probably some seminars and webinars about, especially because of the recently concluded International AIDS Conference, which talked about a lot of new therapies and new innovations, both in prevention and care, that we can talk about afterwards. But if we could go to the next slide, really, our concern for us today in our brief amount of time that we've got here is to really focus on HIV and aging. And probably a lot of you already know that, because a lot of us are part of the boomer generation, right? So that is probably the largest group of people who are aging in the United States and ever. Right, so we're all aging. This boomer generation is all aging, and if we had a chart that showed what the boomer generation is doing, it would kind of look a little similar to this in some regards. But this one is focused on Americans living with HIV, and all the orange bars over there are people who are over 50. And so the CDC had acknowledged in 2020 that over 50%, or 53% to be exact, or 567,355 Americans are living with HIV. And if you can see, those bars are still kind of tall, the gray ones. So that is going to continue going forward. So this is something that is of some urgency for us as people who are living with HIV. We weren't supposed to really age, but thanks to medications, we've been aging. So it's more of a chronic condition. Next slide. So, and the other issue is that we still have people who are over 50 who are getting diagnosed with HIV. And in this chart, it shows that the 55 and older at the bottom, 10% of the people in 2020 were people who are 55 and older with new diagnoses. So we talk a lot about care in terms of HIV and aging, but we also have to talk about prevention as well. So next slide, please. I just want to introduce you a little bit of what I do. I'm a president of an organization in Palm Springs called Let's Kick Ass. ASS is AIDS Survivor Syndrome. It was a group that was started probably 2013 by Tess Anderson, a long-term survivor in San Francisco. We started our chapter of it in Palm Springs and became our own 501c3 in 2018. We're mostly long-term survivors, witnesses to the plague years. We do potlucks, coffees, bowling, and now we have, at the bottom slide shows something we call the LCAPS Roundtable, which is discussion groups. And when we were first hit with COVID and everybody had to isolate, it was Zoom and these roundtable meetings that kept us going as a community. And at the last little bit there, sorry, is that we do have about 450 contacts within our group, which is really kind of a small number, because in Palm Springs, California, we call it God's waiting room. We have a lot of retirees in Palm Springs. And so, and also it's known for, I mean, I think until recently, our 5-member city council was all LGBT. We now have, yeah, it's 4 out of 5 right now. We're having elections coming up soon. It's very LGBT friendly. We do have an active gay community, pride events, all kinds of things. And also because of the warm weather, a lot of people who were considering retiring, gay people from places like Chicago, Minnesota, Francisco, oftentimes come down to Palm Springs. So our group grows because of retirements, people coming down to retire in Palm Springs, and because so many people who are LGBT have HIV, that keeps our group going. Next slide. So while I was here in Cleveland, I had a great time. Came here, I think, the day after my birthday, when I turned 16, which was fun. So I feel legitimately old now, although I was really trending that way a long time ago. So I was working on my PhD degree at USC. I had the opportunity to chair this growing older affinity group for the Department of Health in Ohio. And I'm also going to talk to you a little bit about the Older Americans Act and groups of greatest social need. Next slide, please. So this growing older affinity group created by Kate Shoemate and the Ohio Department of Health is to gather information or input from an often overlooked community within the ending the epidemics, which are people over 50. And if you're familiar with the Ending the Epidemics program, that's something that's been going on for a while, finding new strategies to eradicate HIV in this country. Next slide, please. So as part of this, it's part of this integrated HIV prevention and care plan. It's a federal program. The integrated plan is an umbrella document that sets out local recommendations for all HIV care and prevention services, including but not limited to the Ryan-White HIV/AIDS program and CDC. I think this is Department of HIV prevention funding. And communities should set ambitious goals. And so that's what's driving this particular group. We're actually helping we're community members, we're setting ambitious goals, which means that traditionally Ryan-White AIDS program and the CDC are focused on care and prevention, but oftentimes that's overlooked in the needs of people aging with HIV, particularly in the epidemics program. So taking this broader look gets an opportunity for us in this community in Ohio to actually start setting priorities and giving people some indications about where we think there's opportunities to work with, all of our networks within Ohio to benefit people who are aging with HIV. Excellent. So this was something I came up with after we had several meetings and we were talking about things that we wanted to do. And I don't know if you've ever seen these things. They're called word clouds, and oftentimes I love them because they kind of synthesize in a way what everybody's talking about in just a few words. And this was out of it was nearly 100 different items that we could boil down into some of these. And I think the top three here, community, accessibility, and advocacy, I kind of think of that as in a couple of different ways. One is kind of inward looking, the other one is kind of outward looking, and then the other one is kind of bringing the inward and the outward together. So community is kind of like looking inward, right? Saying, what are our resources? How do we help each other? How do we change our own lives for our own selves, right? And then accessibility is when we're kind of talking about, well, what are the things we need from the outside? What is it that's going to keep us sustained, strong enough to keep moving on? And then the advocacy part is really, a little bit of everybody, right? It's part of the community, it's part of all of the providers and service people that help us. But we're all kind of advocating for the same thing, which is to actually help people who are aging with HIV. So, and then these other points that are kind of floating in the cloud also were so important. I mean, stigma was the next biggest one. That kind of pervades everything, right? I mean, you don't do things in your community, you don't do things with providers, you don't do things in advocacy without considering stigma. And especially for people who are long-term survivors or people who live in the plague years, as we age, we've already gone through the stigma from our diagnosis. Some of us have had challenges based on gender, our race, our sexuality. But now we're all growing old, and so we all of a sudden realize it's a whole bunch of people who don't care about older people, and there's ageism, right? So that's another thing to consider. Planning, we put up there because concerns about end-of-life planning and whether or not we really, we don't think about that very much, whether or not it has to do with wills, things you want to leave behind to people, power of attorneys for when you're going into the hospital, who's going to talk for you when you need that help, and then also comorbidities. We were touching on that for a moment, and income, because one of the issues for a lot of us is that when we actually have migrated from long-term disability to actually Social Security, how do we make that migration? And so for some of us, especially if you've had private insurance for long-term disability, there's a huge cliff that you fall off of in terms of your income. So, so this kind of synthesized for us a lot of different issues that go forward. Next slide, please. So I just want to share with you some of the things that we actually came up with and some of these items. So in community, we had some strengths. We did a SWOT analysis, which is strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats. And so for our strengths, I just want to read off a few of these. Like people living with HIV over 50 are willing to be involved in community. They still have sex. That was an important thing. I showed you that slide about 10% of people still who are over 55 who are being diagnosed with HIV. Acknowledgement of a great deal of wisdom in the community of people living with HIV 50 plus. And we need to tap into that wisdom. For accessibility, there were some weaknesses that we found that senior programs oftentimes have high age limits, 60 plus, and lowering these could help for people living with HIV to age faster. Lack of awareness of aging services among people living with HIV 50 plus. And what I'm saying by that is that oftentimes we're not aware of organizations that have been around for a long time that are aging focused because we've been so siloed in our HIV community work that we haven't gone out to find out other things, other resources. So that was the lack of awareness needs to be addressed there. Services for multiple health problems, comorbidities not available at the same location as HIV services. Transportation was already difficult before having to make appointments with various specialists. Agency meetings are not easily accessible for people living with HIV 50 plus. Telehealth may be a solution. We're talking not Zoom. So, next slide, please. And then for advocacy, some of our strengths were that people living with HIV over 50 were willing to speak truth to power. And they had a history of advocacy and activism among older folks. That U equals U, undetectable equals untransmittable, and treatment as prevention as it relates to people living with HIV 50 plus is something that's actually being discussed. Existence of venues to advocate for services like planning councils, agencies, etc. Those are great strengths. So one of the other things I was working on was the Older Americans Act. And I think if you're not familiar with it, it was one of those things that President Johnson did back in 1965 as a safety net for seniors. So we're all familiar with, Medicare and Social Security being the safety nets, but the Older Americans Act was specifically set up to the side for seniors and established an infrastructure throughout the United States, through all 50 states, for the federal government and the states to actually impact the lives of the people who are aging. And like most federal programs, especially those who were, they're really, as it says, it's a safety net. So define the greatest social need as caused initially by physical and mental disabilities and by cultural, social, or geographic isolation. And so what was kind of a catalyst for me was that in last year in California, we amended our version of the Older Americans Act to include persons living with HIV among those with the greatest social needs. And we were the second state to do that. Illinois was the first. And that got me thinking, because I was like thinking, well, once you do that, once you actually say it's greatest social need, how do we actually implement it? How do we actually go make this law, and it's a law, how do we actually make this law actionable? Next slide, please. So just to give you a little bit of background about what this whole infrastructure is. So the Older Americans Act created this administration on aging, and its services include home delivered and congregate meals, job training, senior centers, health promotion, a lot of great services. It's funded through direct grants to the states. The services are available to all persons age 60 and older, but are targeted to those with greatest economic or social need. So this is the kind of time, right? So if you have people who are aging with HIV identified as among the greatest social need, then you can all of a sudden get tied into the funding source. Okay, so that helps with this whole implementation. And the state structure, each state has a state unit on aging. The state units on aging manage area agencies on aging, the AAAs. And I know the last time I was here, we were all chuckling about this because we all thought that was an automobile association. But no, we're not here to tell you what you're far. The AAAs are here to help seniors. So I apologize, I rushed around and I didn't get the Ohio. There's several Ohio areas on aging, area agencies on aging, but you get one of their logos. Next slide, please. So this is just kind of a representation of the 5 core services under the Older Americans Act: elder rights, caregivers, nutrition, health and wellness, supportive services. Now this should sound familiar to people who are aging. In aging with HIV, because a lot of times when we're talking about HIV groups, we're talking about all of these things, right? But this is just under a whole nother umbrella. So it's all focused on aging. And again, if we're going to tap into this, we have to be acknowledged as, first of all, we have to participate, right? I mean, if you're not, finding out about these services or going to the area agencies on aging, you're not participating, then you're not going to know. But then we also, as people who are aware of the aging needs of people living with HIV, it's also incumbent upon us to actually become aware of these things ourselves and to let you guys know that it's out there. So, and it really is out there. I mean, there was one time recently in California, in Southern California where I live, we used to have a dedicated person to answer legal questions for people who were living with HIV. And so there were a lot of questions about leases, wills, all kinds of stuff that came up. And this guy was a godsend, right? And at one point, I think he was actually paid through Brian White. Then another time, when that didn't happen for whatever reason, one of the service providers in the area took him on as an employee, passed away. So it's kind of tough, but so I didn't have him in Southern California. Now, I know there's people in Northern California, right? But if you know anything about the size of California, that's, it's not only just like more than a 5.5-hour drive. I mean, this is a good distance, right? So, and they've got a lot of people up there that need the same services. So I actually called up somebody from the AAAs and said, I've got somebody here who has this problem. Can you solve it for them? I said, oh, we do this all the time. And it was just, but it was great because, we forget that when we're so focused on HIV as the thing that gets us through the door in some of these service areas, that we forget we're looking at somebody who's over 60 and then say to them, oh, well, there's this whole other world over here and you can start accessing services from, right? So just want to let you say, yeah, no, it was perfect time. Thank you. So we have a new president. Nice. So, but he still has to work with our Congress, right? So what he does is, if he can't get bills passed, he does executive actions. So there was some guidance that was done by the acting assistant secretary for aging, the state unit on aging directors, those are the people who manage all the AAAs. And they took on the idea to make a broad approach to ensuring services are reaching older adults in greatest social need. That didn't specifically say HIV and aging, but if you kind of go down through the document a little ways, one of the things that it does is it gives the area agencies on aging a blueprint of things that they should be considering in their evaluations and in their planning. And part of it is directly addressing HIV and aging. So that's a good thing. And as I was saying, things are, the authority comes from the executive order, and those executive orders are only as good as the executive sitting in the office. So there are bills in Congress that are addressing some of these issues, both for LGBT as a group with greatest social need and HIV and AIDS, making people living with HIV. But maybe, the midterms will have some great results. Forecasting that, but who knows? And we can actually move the legislation. But again, this is something where I'm finding. I think we can go to the next slide. Go back. Yeah. Let's take it. I'm finding, like in California, for example, that there is an issue about how we count LGBT people. Okay. And there's been laws passed in California that requires, like, the Department of Health, Department of Aging, to actually get a count of people who are LGBT in the state. Now, why that's important is because you can't attach dollars to programs unless you know where those dollars are going to. And if those dollars are affecting a certain number of people, they want to know what percentage of that population they're affecting, because they want to make sure that as they continue to improve these programs, that we're reaching a greater and greater share of that population. But if we don't have the numbers, we don't have the data. Now, what's really interesting about that is that when you think about HIV, right? So what I'm really starting to get to the point of is encouraging people who I talk to in those powerful departments is to say, you need to tell the Department of Aging how many HIV positive people you have in your jurisdiction, so that we can actually start telling these planning bodies, where it says planning reports at the bottom, how they can account for how they are addressing these people with greatest social need, which are HIV positive people. So I'll be right back. So that's my new plan of action. We'll see how that goes. But those numbers are there, so hopefully that'll work. Go ahead.
I'm just wondering about the potential stigma in California of people outing themselves. I'm sure there are a lot of people in the senior age group that still live with that of admitting who they are. I now don't know that, but there are people who aren't as going to affect them.
Yeah, oh, absolutely. And the law actually requires the Department of Aging and the Department of Health to report their employees who are LGBT. And they're kind of holding back on that too. And I think given what's happened to this country in the last several years, there's good reason not to want to identify who your employees are who are LGBT. But you know, at some point, there's going to have to be this. Either we do this statistically, anonymously. I don't know exactly how to do this without, you know, having some fanatic bring up people's addresses, posting them on the internet and saying, you know, we got one of these people over here, you know, and bring your gun. So that's a very good question. But I think it takes people like us to like continuously ask the question over and over. So how are you, accountants, right? Because we're smart people, we can figure that out. My last slide was just to say thank you. It's great being here. Really enjoyed my time in Ohio this year, and I'm still reachable. There's a lot of ways to get in contact with me. I think the last slide has our contact information as well. So,
I just have a question. I think for the entire group. Remember coming to the center, and there wasn't a lot happening around and it seemed to I don't think I had this idea. Probably somebody said to me, you know, like, you know, center doesn't do much around in this area anymore, likely because there are organizations task force. And I thought about that and thought, oh, that's interesting. And, you know, the first thing that we could get and get my arms around is bring in more partnerships with organizations to provide, you know, HIV testing, some education we have. We joined the meetings that were taking place. We continue to support both community members who said, like, I don't have a really proper route, you know, like really supported us, you know, advocating for us space for long-term survivors. They have meeting space. That happened for a while. Folks didn't show up. We've gotten better and better at it, you know, in terms of our relationship. And other organizations. I still feel like, you know, like, so what can we do on that? I said, all that to say, this is the sort of, you know, one of those challenges that we've had, and we're easily distracted by all the other stuff, but we understand that this is part of the advocacy that we're talking about. Right here in the states, so I wanted to hear from those who are interested in this advocacy. We'd like to see what
I'll start with my answer. The center needs to be a pivotal part of each everyone's community living here. And you have space here named after that space. And it's more than just testing. It was also support groups for those that were being diagnosed. It was for those of us that were long-term survivors. And at that time, it was only 2, 3, 4 years at the most. And I remember those days vividly. It's a 31-year survivor. It was free haircuts. It was free massages that you could sign up for every week. There are very little to no HIV positive for people living with AIDS that serve on any boards in this community. Why is that?
well, we don't know.
I mean, even at the AIDS task force, even at the AIDS task force, where are
So what I'm asking, I feel I hear your passion.
but you have, I'm answering your question though.
Yeah.
That's where you start. I mean, we have to have a voice on your boards. We have to be present. There's nobody offering.
We do have people who are HIV positive. I will say
I
that.
said little.
But what I said, and I'm not
Sorry.
disputing what you're saying here, but concrete solutions that you mentioned groups.
Yes.
So what we would need is, because we have those, people don't show up. So,
But I'm finding, and don't take this the wrong way, since we're being here in November, a lot of your things I'm not worrying about till a day or two before. 3 at the most.
well, we
And
have,
I live in walking distance from here.
okay,
And I'm
so,
on the Facebook page and I'm on email list.
so something we can do is continue to provide a space for social support groups. And we would like to see the marketing go out. So
So
some
pretty
of the-
haircuts. There are enough barbers and hairdressers in our community to do that. No offense, and not to be stereotypical, but there are. I mean, people volunteer to cut their hair. And there were times in the past where I couldn't even afford a haircut.
So I'm more,
I'm
so
just
what
being
we-
honest.
What we need to do is ask more broadly what the need is, because there are people who we can set up haircuts, you know, like, is that? That's what I'm saying, like, how should we conduct the survey? Should we find out, you know, what, survivors need, want, and then build it?
You know, and
I really don't, we're willing to create the capacity to work for it, but I need to know that we're doing the right
well,
thing.
and I think you should build a working community relationship, and I've said this a couple different times, we only have one chained nursing home in Ohio, it's also in Michigan, has a place in Tennessee, Indiana, and Illinois, and that's United Church Homes of Christ. They are saved, sponsored, and affiliated, and certified until all that changes comes the end of this year. The director of intake there, his name is Jerry Martin. There were people that were working from here with him or were meeting with him, because I, myself, with Jerry, when I lived there in California, which is only 40 minutes away, sat down to change the intake policy to be more inclusive. They are begging for people to help them. United Church Homes,
So you're
which is part of
asking me to-
UCC churches.
Are you yelling at me?
No, I'm not. No, I'm not. But I've said this numerous times, and there are people somewhere working supposedly. I haven't heard more than, oh, there's conversations that have started, but they're desperate, wanting to reach our community. I mean, they were at Pride, Akron Gay Pride last year, handing out brochures. And the majority of the people that I talked to that day wasn't even aware that Sage last year, granted that may be changing, was training nursing homes. We have one of those facilities in this area 40 minutes away. We have an assisted living care facility for people within our community right in Medford with that organization, UCC Homes. They have program. They're wanting to develop programming there. They were wanting to do outreach to students there on our behalf, people living with HIV and AIDS. I think the center, that could be one huge concrete thing the center could do to change the face of nursing and care from individual care to people that invest in condos down there at the tune of $100,000, which includes lifelong up to skilled care nursing until the day they die.
I'm gonna be honest with you, I don't understand, but I'm willing to try to understand, maybe not now.
Right, I'm just saying there's the opportunity,
More complicated than what I was.
right, because at some point, unless we have family or created family, we all face the possibility of going into a home. And research that I was doing about the time you were doing yours, 50% of people in a nursing home intake environment, just the intake, are harassed, and 50% of them are charged more. The number of people that then get into homes, nursing homes, this is, 50% of them are at least, at the minimum, misgendered to sexually harassed. Other people contribute some ideas. I'm just trying to answer the breath.
Would you, I do love those ideas and I do think that they're great, but I think what Seven's question was more geared towards, you know, what we can specifically start doing here at the center. Like you mentioned, the haircuts and things like that, that's awesome. Does anybody
I
else
think
have?
this outreach is a great way with this
Yeah,
nursing home.
Yeah, and that as well too, that's, yes.
I have a question. The gorilla in the room, literally, monkeypox. Is there any research, if you're HIV positive, is monkeypox going to hurt you worse? And why in Ohio it's impossible to get monkeypox vaccine? I know people that gone to Chicago and they can get it. I know people that are going to New York.
Point of information. There's actually a wonderful monkeypox webinar here at the center tonight with the head of the Cleveland Department of Public Health, head of the County Department of Public Health, and they're here to answer all of those questions specifically, and it will definitely include people that
And if you can't come back, you can zoom in, record it.
Yeah.
So you record it, if you, because we want to send questions that you have, so when you record it, you zoom in.
Hopefully there'll be information like here, oh, there was a place on the east side, they got 1,000 things, 1,000 doses, and so hopefully.
So that's all, they are the experts.
Yeah.
They are the experts in the center. The short answer is it is available. So we stay on
It is
aging.
available.
We
Yeah.
stay on aging.
Yeah.
I have a question.
Yeah.
A question on aging, okay. And it sort of follows up with what you brought up. It's like Cleveland is an old city. Take away nothing. Take away HIV or the gays or anything. Just Cleveland is a lot of old people, one of the old cities. I know not too long ago, Scranton was the only other city that was older.
Older than me, it's crazy.
Older than, yeah, well, yeah. I know, no, it is, it's just aging. And the question is, were you able to, and I know the support groups, I know Rob Toad and the guy over at Doug Best.
Yeah.
For years have put this out. And we know that loneliness and isolation is important, but sometimes you build it and they don't come. They truly don't come. I mean, it's not anybody's fault that they don't come because something's not clicking. Did you get a sense from the people you talked to? Because I've heard this a lot. We need to. That really that's what's wanted? Is a support group? Is it that isolation? Is it just a general sense of, I'm talking about people living with HIV, aging. I mean, our CAB, which our community advisory board, we lost 3 people within a space of 6 months. Still not, we're not going to be too, but what's the sense of the community of what is wanted, or don't they know what they want? I say they.
I'll tell you from my experience in Palm Springs, I was kind of surprised that we were so successful with our groups. And we recently expanded. I mean, we just were doing a weekly Zoom meeting. And now we're doing a weekly Zoom meeting, and you saw the picture, we've actually started renting a room to have meetings there. I think we've actually expanded to two nights of live meetings. And the discussion groups have kind of evolved. I mean, I think they're even about to evolve a little bit more because I think the leaders of this group really want to have speakers as well. So it's not just a matter of just talking amongst themselves, but they want people who have some expertise to come into the room and say, well, what's working in your community, or what should we be thinking about, or those kind of ideas. So, which has been very interesting. So it's percolating. I think part of the issue too for us is that we're like relearning how to be in person again, because we spent so much time being apart. So, to actually tell people it's not like the baseball stadium, you built it, they'll come kind of thing. So, because we're still used to being in our spaces, our personal spaces, and probably just even having this particular discussion being on Zoom is indicative of that. Sometimes we just kind of like, we'd rather be in our jammies and have our refrigerator 5 steps away than to get out and be with people. So we have to relearn how to be with people again. And older people have a hard time doing that.
my problem, her problem, your problem, our problem. Is it times have changed? Apathy has invaded us. I'm HIV negative. I have all my, I was before. The new drugs come out. I helped raise over $100,000 for infected and unaffected people with AIDS. One night with less than 400 people, we raised over $35,000. Times have changed. Okay? And I'm sure others have heard it. The center don't do anything. The center this, the center that. Well, I never see you at the center. I never see you volunteering. I don't see anybody helping. All I do is, if you're not part of the solution, you're part of the problem. And we can't drag people in here. This is a fabulous place. Okay. I'm not a board, well, I'm a board member of the group formerly known as SAGE. We are now Rainbow.
Pioneers.
Old farts.
Well, we'll keep asking the question, you know, we get that, we understand that, you know, we have an English term to get, sometimes it's a good question, it's a good, you know, calling in. So we, as I understand it, it's not something that we just think about when we have guests here. It is something that we have thought about. We do have some ideas in place, but we don't have our facilitators. And so we're gonna keep asking the question. We'll be going into a strategic planning process, you know, coming up here, hopefully early next year. But really, continue to ask the question.
Is that exclusive to paid staff here, or is that open to the?
We are not a membership organization, which is, we get zinged on all the time because our elders remember that. And but yes, the strategic planning process will be, there will be an opportunity for focus groups. So we can't do it without talking about, you know, older LGBTQ adults and those who are, you know, living as well. So yes, but, you know, like, so, help us as you continue to think about this, and talk to other people, to find out what people really want. So you're absolutely right. We're trying to figure out, you know, we don't want to just do something and then folks don't show up, and, you know, and it takes us time and energy and resources, and we're trying to get it right. And so the way that I get it right, and we think we get it right, is we begin to ask the question and get information.
I see his hand first and that hand second.
I think part of the problem is a lot of us that are old-time survivors, 30 years this last July. So a lot of us have suffered from burnout. We've just done so much, so long, for so many, raised so much money. As you said, times have changed. We feel we've done our share. The community has changed so much. We don't know what to do. We feel we've already done it. We aren't seeing any of the actions fast enough. If we can somehow address, I don't know the answer, to address that burnout in a different way, or at least address the animals in the room for burnout, maybe that's the start. I wish I had the answer to that. I don't think it's going to come easy though. Because I think Brooks burnout is, if he even has it, way different than mine versus Marie's or anybody else's. It's such an individual thing.
Okay, thank you. Yes.
Two quick things. I moved from California after 50 years, so back to Ohio where I'm family. One thing, nothing personal to anybody, but I don't think many gay people realize how hurtful it is, especially older guys, saying proudly, I'm HIV negative. It hurts a lot of people, sort of like I'm better than you. I know they don't mean it that way, but I've run into that. In California, you just assume people are HIV positive, and people don't make anything of it. But since I moved back to Ohio, people my age, I've heard, oh, I was going to move to California. Thank God I didn't. Otherwise, I'd be dead. Like you were safe because you were in Ohio. And that's generally it. you know, it's a negative thing for people to be boasting about it. You know, we understand that sometimes they might not realize how hurtful. The other, and then the question with COVID. We always heard about for COVID, if you're diabetic or overweight, these are factors that are going to hurt you more. Has there been any research or consensus about being HIV positive? COVID is still going around. The president's wife has got it. People aren't aware. They think COVID's over. You know, people are getting it. Are HIV people more susceptible to the side effects or maybe in long-term COVID? Any research on that?
Yeah, I don't have the specific research on that, although you might want to stay around and ask that question again, because I'm sure the answers are going to be similar for the monkeypox issue. But I want to get to, you raise the issue of stigma, and that's why that's a big issue for the research that we were doing for the Ohio Department of Health, because that's so important. You know, it just turns people off. I mean, if you heard that, I can just hear you, you know, that proverbial, you know, fingers going across the chalkboard when you hear those statements, and it just makes you cringe and you just want to remove yourself from those people. And it's more difficult, I think, going back to your point too, is when we're like the stage of burnout and, you know, oh, I've fought these fights before. I don't want to fight these battles anymore, which creates a situation where you end up isolating even more, right?
Yes.
Because that's why older people are isolating, because they don't want to hear it. They've heard it a million times, right? But the wonderful thing that we're finding out here is that you may be burned out over those kind of issues like stigma, right? But one of the things that you remember, the strengths was that we've got stories to tell. We have, you know, our own tales of making it through tough times, right? So your voices are necessary in these discussions about monkeypox or MPX, I like to call it, because I don't like the monkeypox thing. But MPX, you know, so your voice is important because you as a survivor know what it takes. You have those skills, right? And you can talk to people. This is what got me through this. And I don't know you, but I would guess that if somebody asked you for your wisdom on those issues, that you would be energetic and you would be willing to do that. And you would not feel burned out, right? So we just need to find those things that get you re-energized and make you want to participate without falling into these areas that are really just kind of like, I just want to go. Oh.
And now with the stigma, with gay men getting monkeypox, are we going to have another stigma? You know, oh, I don't want to.
It's already started. It's already started. It's already started. I'm gonna go to him first.
I just want to say my negative status is not meant to be hurtful. My negative status, as I wanted to portray it, was that I've been an ally. I've been in the HIV community for 30 years. Since I lived in Greece and we heard of young men getting grid in San Francisco, and I was one of those young men.
Right. Right, which is important for my group, because in California, I always refer to as long-term survivors and witnesses to the plague years, because people who were witnesses to the plague years know everybody almost as much about all of that stigma, all of those issues that we as people who are living with HIV know about.
Before we knew how it was transmitted.
Right.
For some of us are both.
Right. I mean, I was negative before I became positive.
Why do you witnesses and survivors?
Are we running out of time?
Yeah, it's one, so we'll take one last question and then you guys can wrap up.
It's two small questions. They're the umbrella one. So the first one was, in your research, were there any concrete findings around what, folks in our community need around support, around resources? Like, I don't know if you were particularly examining that question in your research, but if there was anything. The second one, when you were mentioning the area agencies of aging, I felt like I learned something really, really new, because I did not realize that are they required to provide those services? So like, if we have folks, because we deal with this a lot in our Rainbow Pioneer group, where, you know, as people are getting older, rent's going up, but you're on limited income, you need support around housing. Are those area agencies on aging supposed to provide support and resources around those, and how do we make that happen?
See, the thing is, you would do exactly what I did with my person who needed legal help, right?
Okay.
Which is to just call up one of those folks and say, I've got somebody who's over 60 who needs this. Tell me where I should go.
The problem is most of us are under 60 that are struggling with that, and they are long-time survivors. So
Right.
like,
Right. Well, that's where the advocacy comes in, right? Because we just need to advocate for more of those services for people. And this is where the challenge in the advocacy has been, right? So who are we advocating to, right? Are we advocating to the people who are the area agencies on aging to say lower that age to 50 because AARP will send you that request for a $5 donation when I turn 50? And I should be getting services at 50, but you're not getting them until I'm 60? Or should we be going to the AIDS service organizations and saying, look, you know, the area agencies on aging don't acknowledge the fact that we're aging, but you know, because there's lots of research that says this, and blah, 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 so you need to make space for us here. You gotta do both, right? So it's a challenge, definitely it's a challenge. The first question was,
in your research that you were doing here, were there any like?
oh, I really wanted to get to that one because over the years, I've seen survey over survey over survey. I think what's really important for this group is to really get to know the people who come here, who are local here. And I would almost encourage you to just do this kind of conversation again, do a town hall maybe, get some more speakers, do a speaker series again, get more people like me in here saying, you know, we'd like to talk to you about this in the community, and see if you start developing that conversation further. Right, because I think, you know, surveys are great, you know, we can do it based on services, based on, you know, and then you might end up having the same thing. It's like, oh, I wanted a pizza night, but nobody showed up for the pizza night. Right, so.
Brainstorming table with survivors from here and the AIDS task force, is that been done by anybody?
Well, that's kind of like the town hall idea. So like you just bring people in and just have a conversation about a particular issue and have it facilitated by somebody who maybe doesn't have a stake in the game, so that they can at least seem somewhat neutral when you're going around the room and getting people's opinions.
Yeah. Absolutely. All right, well, awesome. Thank you, everybody, for coming. Thanks to folks on Zoom. I know it was a little bit difficult, but thanks for hanging in there. So, yeah, thank you for coming. And if you have any more questions, we'll be up here for a few minutes. So.
And Jack tried to pound Springs in August.
All this.